Put this in stone. Come back a year from now. Tell me, oh my gosh, Mason, you're an idiot. You were way too low on Malik Neighbors. Here are my top 50 wide receiver rankings after camp, after preseason, after trades, after holdout news. I mean, after suspensions. We'll talk about it all. Starting off with our new wide receiver one, Mr. Tyreek Hill. If you are looking at Tyreek, there's just nothing that can go wrong here. Yes, he's 30, but he was on pace to have 2,000 receiving yards last season. Remember, we pretty much all were saying it was finally going to happen. Then yes, the Miami Dolphins trail off at the end of the year. Yes, Tyreek misses. But regardless, we saw the elite output over 110 receiving yards per game last season. He's going to be 30. That's potentially the only red flag. But the Miami Dolphins are currently projected to be a top 5 scoring offense in the NFL, according to sportsbooks this season. CeeDee Lamb at 2. Yes, is younger. Yes, has less competition. And yes, was previously my wide receiver one. Now, the entire holdout situation is just going to drop him one spot down for me. Not that I'm expecting him to miss any time. Not that I'm expecting him to, I don't know, fall off a cliff. I'm just a little bit worried. If you don't go to training camp, are you at a little bit of a higher risk for injury? Are you at a little bit of a higher risk for potentially starting off slowly at the beginning of the year? So I'll give Tyreek the slight edge over him, but obviously can't go wrong in either way. Amon-Ra St. Brown will be our guy, jumping Jamar Chase at 3. We'll talk about both these players. St. Brown, literally no worries. Wide receiver last year that averaged 17 points per game, a 95 receiving yards per game, only going to be 25, and this is an offense that projects to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this season. Going over to Chase, one, he's never had a season as good of what Amon-Ra St. Brown did last year. And two, with the entire holdout situation, I'm just a little bit worried that, yes, he missed a large chunk of training camp. Maybe he starts off a little slower than you would expect. Maybe he's at a little bit of a higher risk of injury. Now, I will admit, I took Jamar Chase to pick 7 in the Flock League. He is my wide receiver 1. So I am sending up a prayer that Jamar Chase comes out and crushes, because I do think he has the upside to be the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy. Now, looking at Justin Jefferson at pick 5, this is a wide receiver that has been plummeting down draft boards as of late. In underdog drafts, I've seen Jefferson fall to picks 8, 9. I mean, hell, in the Flock League, I saw Justin Jefferson fall down to pick 10. Yes, Corey from FSC, for some reason, took Garrett Wilson over the guy. Now, obviously, I kind of understand why he did it. I mean, you have Sam Darnold there. Darnold is going to put a cap on the overall output that we should expect from the Minnesota Vikings. I will say this should be the best situation of Sam Darnold's NFL career. Justin Jefferson did average over 100 receiving yards per game last year with Kirk Cousins missing time. So I believe he's the most talented wide receiver in the NFL. If Cousins was still there, Justin Jefferson would easily be the wide receiver 1 in my rankings. But it's hard to ignore the fact that your quarterback is Sam Darnold, and it's hard to just act like nothing has happened. Now, going over to our next tier, A.J. Brown will be our next guy. Super safe option. You know what to expect. 2.7 yards per route run for 3 straight seasons. 113 intended total air yards per game last year. The change with the offensive coordinator should hopefully help this passing offense, where we may actually see the pass attempts go up in Philadelphia. And yes, they trade for Jahan Dotson, but the reality of the situation is I actually think Dotson maybe takes a few targets away from Dallas Goedert, and I really don't think he has any impact on A.J. Brown. Now, Garrett Wilson will be our next guy. Now, we're going to talk about Garrett Wilson, Drake London, and Chris Olave all in this video, and I think that we can say almost the same thing about all 3 of these guys. Based off the market share numbers, based off their college profiles coming into the NFL, it's very safe to say that we know they are extremely talented. In the case of all 3 of those wide receivers, they have been held back in fantasy through the first 2 years of their NFL career due to garbage quarterback play. Now, with Garrett Wilson, he arguably gets the best quarterback upgrade you're going to see in the NFL, going from Zach Wilson to Aaron Rodgers. For that reason, I'm going to put him at 7. I did previously have Puka Nacua ranked ahead of Garrett Wilson. Puka Nacua just puts up the best rookie wide receiver season of all time. Was I expecting it? No. Am I an idiot? Yes. We all understand that at this point. 2.7 yards per route run as a rookie. Now, the only reason I'm going to have him at the bottom end of this tier is the knee injury he suffered early on in training camp. If you actually look at the Flock League, Puka Nacua went behind Drake London. Sal Vetri took Drake London ahead of Puka. I mean, obviously, London's one of the most polarizing players that you're going to find in fantasy football this season. You have to take him in round 2 if you want him. Maybe in your redraft league, he falls to you in round 3. I'll confidently say if he falls to you in round 3, 100% smash pick, go ahead and take him. Now, London finds himself in a similar situation in Garrett Wilson. You go ahead, you look at the prospect profile, you look at the market share numbers, you look at him averaging 2 yards per route run in one of the worst offenses in the NFL last season. Say, okay, Kirk Cousins coming in, he's finally going to get solid quarterback play. His situation's going to turn around for the better, and maybe you have that type of explosive Drake London season. Now, I know a lot of other people are going to say, well, Mason, he's never been a top 40 wide receiver from a points per game perspective. This is a wild, wild ranking, and I would agree with you, but looking at the wide receivers behind him, I think you could poke holes in all of their profiles. Going over to Marvin Harrison Jr., he officially has a round 1 ADP in underdog drafts, which is nuts. I mean, but he went at pick 12 in the flock league as well. The best wide receiver prospect that we have seen in quite some time. And typically with these elite wide receiver prospects, what you have is you have them go top 5 picks of the NFL draft. They get stuck with absolutely garbage quarterback play. Talk about Malik Neighbors a little bit later on. And they are really not set up for success. However, this is a very unique situation in Arizona where the reason they had that top 5 pick was due to Kyler Murray missing a large chunk of last season. And Harrison is actually in a very good situation this year where he is going to have much better quarterback play than what you would typically see from a wide receiver selected inside the top 5 picks of the NFL draft. You don't really have any wide receiver competition. I mean, the guy that you just had here actually ended up getting suspended in Zay Jones. So really you're only competing against Michael Wilson and Trey McBride. Now, somebody that Danny from the Fantasy Stock Exchange actually convinced me to move up my rankings. He's been a riser pretty much all season, and I just took him in round 2 of the Flock League. Nico Collins. Now, if you were looking at Nico Collins, obviously last year, he absolutely crushed 14.5 fantasy points per game, 86.5 receiving yards per game. As a 24-year-old wide receiver, this is beautiful. If you go through and if you look at who he comped to historically at 24 years old, you have Chris Godwin, Greg Jennings, Devonta Smith, Tyler Boyd, Jalen Waddle, Santana Moss, Allen Hurns, Tank Dell. What I am most excited about is specifically looking under the hood and looking at his 3.3 yards per route run. Plus, if we combine this with the preseason usage of these Houston Texans wide receivers, we actually see that Nico Collins is going to be the guy that's on the field for pretty much every snap. It looks like Tank Dell may only be on the field in 3 wide receiver sets. In certain personnel packages, we actually saw Stefon Diggs leave the field. Nico is going to be on the field for almost every snap with CJ Stroud, who I believe to be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Stepping into his prime at 25 years old, 3.3 yards per route run last season. Very excited about Nico Collins, which is why I took him in the middle of the second round in the Flock League and why he's going in the middle of the second round of underdog drafts. Now, in your regular ESPN draft, your Yahoo draft, where I'd probably be looking to take Nico Collins is in round 3 if you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex. Why I was willing to take him in the second round of my league is in my league, I actually have 2 flex spots so I can start up to 4 wide receivers in a full PPR format. Now, going down to our next guy, Deebo Samuel has had an ADP all over the place this year. The more we go by, the more it looks like Brandon Aiyuk is a Niner this next season. Obviously, if Aiyuk's a Niner, makes Deebo Samuel a little bit less exciting, but we've already seen the elite ceiling from him 2 years ago, or 3 years ago at this point, averaging almost 19 fantasy points per game, and we know the Niners project out to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL this season. Now, going over to Chris Olave. Yes, I know Chris Olave is the cool guy to hate on. Yes, I know if you were looking at Olave, he has bad quarterback play this year, which is why when we compare him to the other wide receivers in that same draft class, such as Garrett Wilson, such as Drake London, it's going to be very difficult to rank Chris Olave as high as those other players when he is stuck with the checkdown princess in Derek Carr. But if you do go over and look at Olave in depth, I mean, this is a wide receiver that last year in year 2 averaged almost 12 points per game, back-to-back seasons with over 2 yards per route run, back-to-back seasons with over 100 in total intended air yards per contest. So I think those are positives. Now, going over to Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle's a wide receiver that actually improved from a yards per route run perspective last year, going from 2.7 to 2.9 yards per route run. Actually improved with his receptions per game from 4.4 to 5.1. Got a little bit unlucky with touchdowns, but now that Miami projects to be a top 5 offense in the NFL yet again, I do think it's a very safe pick with Jalen Waddle. Now, Davante Adams will be a player that's very interesting to discuss. Because if you look at Davante Adams in like ESPN drafts, there Davante Adams goes close to like the wide receiver 10. If you're drafting on Underdog, which I want to say probably the sharper drafters are at this point, there Davante Adams is falling to the 3rd round. Davante Adams going like wide receiver 20. So I find myself in an interesting spot where if I can take Davante Adams at like pick 20 in an Underdog draft, I'm going to be doing that every single day till the season starts. Whereas if I was in my regular redraft league, like in the Flock League, and no, I'm going to go Nico Collins over Davante Adams. The reason being is if you look at Adams, he's had 3 straight seasons of decline, going from 17.5 to 16.5 down to 12.5 fantasy points per game. 3 straight seasons of decline in 2.9 to 2.5 to 2.1 yards per route run. He's going to be 32 years old this season. Sportsbooks are projecting the Raiders to be the 6th lowest scoring offense in the NFL this year. So all that makes me a little bit worried about Adams. I do want to remind you, though, if you like Davante Adams, I'd highly recommend taking him at like wide receiver 20, specifically in Underdog drafts, where even if you already drafted your main fantasy football team, I would definitely recommend, just to have some extra fun, hop into an Underdog fantasy football draft. There's no time commitment at all during the season because they are best ball. That's how I stream there every single night. That's how I draft hundreds of teams every year. It's how I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. By far and away my favorite place to draft. And if you use code FLOCK, you're actually going to get my 2024 rankings, my 2024 draft guide, 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet. Plus, you're going to come away with a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1, which is exclusive to Flock users. But Underdog's also running another promo, Travis Kelce, more than less than half a total yard for week 1 as well, if you sign up with code FLOCK and make your first deposit. Plus, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. So make sure you take advantage of that with the link in the description and comment section. Now, going to our last wide receiver in this tier, we are going to have Brandon Aiyuk. It looked very scary for Aiyuk for a period of time where it looked like Aiyuk was possibly a Pittsburgh Steeler, where he's maybe going over to Washington. And that's still very much a possibility, not a probability at this point. And if he were to be shipped out of San Fran, Aiyuk would fall down my rankings in a dramatic way because those potential landing spots should just be much worse offenses overall, where we already discussed you actually have the Niners projecting out to be the highest scoring offense in the league this season. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to look at Cooper Kupp. Now, Cooper Kupp has been on the decline, similar to what you've had with Davante Adams, where if you look over the past 3 years, Cooper Kupp in 2021 averages 21.5 points per game. This past year, 11 points per game. You go back 3 years ago, 3.4 yards per route run. This past year, 2.1 yards per route run. You add on the fact that Puka Nacua was just the best rookie wide receiver of all time. You add on the fact that Cooper Kupp's going to be 31 years old. I find myself in Underdog drafts where Cooper Kupp is getting drafted ahead of Brandon Aiyuk, getting drafted ahead of Davante Adams, almost completely avoiding him. But in your regular redraft league, I've been seeing Cooper Kupp fall to round 4. And if you really wanted to take a shot and just say, oh, maybe just Cooper Kupp was hurt last year, if he is fully healthy this season, he could get back to where he was in 2022, then you can take that shot. Now, DK Metcalf will be our next wide receiver. I understand with the offensive coordinator change, a lot of people are very excited about the Seattle Seahawks options. This should be a more pass-happy offense. We should have more 3 wide receiver sets. I do want to remind y'all, though, DK Metcalf is going into his age 27 season, and he's had 1 year of his NFL career where he's been higher than the wide receiver 20 from a points per game perspective. So even though, like I've said before, DK Metcalf looks like a monster, he looks like he has all the upside in the world, he has the same frame that I do, which of course is just a freakazoid. I don't necessarily think that you can just assume that he has all the fantasy football upside in the world because of his frame, because if you look under the hood, he just doesn't get a ton of volume as you would see with some of these other players. Like DJ Moore last year has had more volume than we ever saw from DK Metcalf. DJ Moore averaging 14 points per game last year with some of the worst quarterback play in the entire NFL. Now you have a significant upgrade going from Justin Fields to Caleb Williams, but you also have a lot more target competition, right? You go from Darnell Mooney to Rome Odunze. You go from a third option that just simply didn't exist to Keenan Allen. So what you're going to see with DJ Moore is you're going to see the volume fall, but you are going to see the efficiency rise because defensive coordinators aren't going to be able to focus as much as they would otherwise on DJ Moore. Now, Stefon Diggs will be our next guy. Now, with Stefon Diggs, obviously, it's the tale of two stories with him last year. Tale of two cities, whatever the hell it is. The first half of the year, Stefon Diggs, phenomenal. I mean, this is a wide receiver that just is on pace to continue to be elite as he was in 2022, in 2021. Then you had the offensive coordinator change, and Stefon Diggs went from crushing to being unstartable in fantasy. And it's even worse than being unstartable because he was getting targeted. He had the name appeal. He was still an elite offense. So we were starting him and just getting 0 points from it. Extremely frustrating. The Bills move on from him. They ship him over to Houston. They should have great quarterback play this year. This should be a phenomenal Houston Texans offense. I think based off the preseason usage, you for sure have to have Nico Collins ahead of Stefon Diggs. But also based on the preseason usage, I personally have him ahead of Tank Dell. Now, going over and looking at Malik Neighbors, I want to be on record. I think Malik Neighbors in 2025 is going to be so good. I really hope that we are able to get Malik Neighbors at a discount next offseason because that discount just simply doesn't exist right now. If you go over to Underdog Drafts, Malik Neighbors goes ahead of Diggs, ahead of Moore, ahead of Metcalf, ahead of Kupp, ahead of Aiyuk. I've seen him ahead of freaking Devontae Adams in these drafts. And I'm not paying the price there at the 2-3 turn because if you look at the historical data, wide receiver ones in bottom 5 offenses were less likely to finish as top 24 options in fantasy than wide receiver ones in top 5 offenses were to finish as top 3 options in fantasy, which is nuts. I know you probably don't believe me, but I promise you we talked about this at length earlier in the offseason. I spent literally a week doing all this research for everybody. If you're in a horrible offense, you're going to be severely capped. In my mind, the difference between like Malik Neighbors and Devontae Adams being in horrible offenses is we know Devontae Adams is a very good wide receiver, and we think Malik Neighbors is a very good wide receiver. But we're pretty confident that they're both going to be in garbage offenses. I think Neighbors should be an absolute target hog in a very bad offense, but I think he's kind of like a more expensive Terry McLaurin, who we'll talk about in just one second. Now, going over to Rishie Rice. Rishie Rice has been a massive riser where a lot of people are coming out and saying, yeah, Rice isn't getting suspended this year. And if you look at the last half of last season, when Rishie Rice actually took over as a starter in KC, Rishie Rice turned out to be a league winner. I mean, from an efficiency perspective, he averaged 2.5 yards per route run. Now, of course, he is operating close to the line of scrimmage. Only 31 intended total air yards per game last year. And you add in Xavier Worthy, you add in Hollywood Brown. But these two wide receivers bring speed to this offense, potentially stretching NFL defenses, creating more space underneath for Rishie Rice as well as Travis Kelce. So it's a wide receiver that was a good rookie going into year 2. That's in a very good offense. It's pretty much everything that you look for. Now, of course, you have to be a little bit concerned about him getting suspended. I know that there's been a lot of stuff regarding the potential court dates that you have, but I don't know. We just saw the NFL decide to suspend Zay Jones based off their own private investigation. A little worried that that same thing may happen with Rice. Now, Michael Pittman Jr., I'm not going to move his ranking. Yes, Anthony Richardson looked very bad in the preseason. It's the preseason. I still stand by. I have no idea if Anthony Richardson's going to be a good real-life quarterback. I think he's going to be good in fantasy because he's going to run the ball a ton. And this should be a very low-volume passing attack, which is why I haven't been all in on Pittman. But the Josh Downs injury is pretty good for him. Just gives him that boosted target share. And Zay Flowers will be our next wide receiver here. If you look at Flowers, similar to Rice, where he was a good rookie that projects to be in a good offense, that really is only target competition's going to be Mark Andrews here. Now, of course, the main question that you're going to have is how much passing volume can there be if Lamar Jackson just goes out there and runs the ball a ton? Because a lot of people were expecting this Baltimore Ravens offense last year to jack up the passing volume, and that just simply didn't happen. Our next guy will be Tank Dell. If you are looking at Tank Dell, I don't know. The preseason was not great for him. He came out, he kind of showed that he is really only going to be getting used in 3 wide receiver sets. He had 2.4 yards per route run, 101 intended total air yards per game last season. A phenomenal rookie year, and he's in a great offense. You want to give that player the benefit of the doubt. That's typically the player that makes sense to go all in on. My hesitation with Tank Dell is we may be overrating his rookie season just a little bit because he was a 24-year-old rookie. Like Tank Dell may be older than Drake London, actually. And also, if you look at Tank Dell, he is tiny. The injury concerns will be there. We have never seen a wide receiver other than Tank Dell at this size find success from a fantasy football perspective. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we are going to go ahead. We are going to look at T. Higgins. With Higgins, I'm fine going in on him. I was a little bit worried with him potentially changing offenses because if he got stuck in Carolina, RIP is going to be toast, but I would way rather have him in Cincinnati, even if he has to compete with Jamar Chase for targets. You have what should be elite quarterback play with Joe Burrow. We're going back to what we were talking about previously. We are looking at sportsbooks currently projecting out the Cincinnati Bengals to be a borderline top 5 offense in total points scored. Now, our next guy will be Terry McLaurin. Now, I mentioned in the last video that Terry McLaurin was probably too low on our rankings. And since then, Terry McLaurin definitely needs to rise a little bit more with the departure of Jahan Dotson. Now, Dotson probably toast. His departure may not necessarily mean that Terry McLaurin's going to come out and turn into a wide receiver 1, because the issue that you are going to have with McLaurin is this is a wide receiver that's in an offense where the passing volume is going to be severely capped. While I believe that Jaden Daniels could very much be the best quarterback from a talent perspective that Terry McLaurin's ever played with, Jaden Daniels himself may go out there, run the ball a ton, have a very average low depth of targets. And if you are looking at the passing volume last year, at one point last season, Sam Howell was leading the NFL in pass attempts and passing yards, and Terry McLaurin still wasn't a viable option in fantasy. His highest career finish ever was the wide receiver 20 from a points per game perspective. But just in case anybody's watching this that's playing in the Flock League, where I took Terry McLaurin in round 6, and he is my 5th wide receiver. Terry McLaurin, he is going to be a top 10 option this year, and he is on the trade block. Please hit my DMs because I want to help you out, and I'll send you an offer that's going to help your team more than it'll help mine. But let's move this over. George Pickens will be our next guy. With Pickens, there was a little bit of a scare where it looked like Brandon Aiyuk may have been a Pittsburgh Steeler. Those rumors have cooled down. That looks less likely. But, I mean, we've seen Justin Fields. We've seen Russell Wilson in the preseason here. They've looked like just absolutely horrendous options at quarterback. George Pickens last year, 3.7 receptions per game. He's a big play guy that historically hasn't commanded a lot of volume, that hasn't really been able to generate a ton of separation with his route running. Great at the catch point, will make some highlight grabs with the defender draped all over him. But my personal preference in fantasy is instead of the big play guy that's not going to have a lot of volume and not going to create a ton of separation, I'd rather go for the guy that's going to have a ton of volume, it's going to create separation. I don't really need the highlight grabs. It's a bad offense here. Amari Cooper will be our next guy, and I think you can make an argument to move Amari higher than this. Last year, 126 intended total air yards per game. Now, of course, a lot of these came with Joe Flacco under center. If y'all remember last year, Joe Flacco was giving us his best Jameis Winston impression, where he went, you know what? I'm just chunking it. We are going to be slinging it all over the field. I don't care. Helped Amari Cooper a ton. If you look over the past 2 years, Amari Cooper's averaged almost 16 points per game in a full PPR format with no Deshaun Watson, where he's been at 13.5 points per game in a PPR format with Deshaun. If you think Deshaun Watson can get back to his former self, I would encourage you to rank Amari Cooper higher than this, but he is going to be 30 years old this next season. Now, our next guy will be Calvin Ridley. With Calvin Ridley, you have the DeAndre Hopkins injury. It looks like Hopkins may not be missing a ton of time here. We've had some recent updates with Hopkins that are indicating that he could be good for week 1. But with that being said, I mean, Hopkins is a wide receiver that missed a large chunk of training camp. Hopkins is a wide receiver that's going into his age 32 season. Calvin Ridley did get paid $72 million this year. So I think it just simply separates Ridley possibly from DeAndre Hopkins. Now, I am potentially concerned with the Tennessee Titans, where right now sportsbooks are projecting them to be the 5th lowest scoring offense in the NFL this season. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to look at Jaden Reed. Now, with Reed, it is so difficult to project out what is going to happen here in Green Bay. The positive of this Jayden Reed profile is that he was one of the more efficient Green Bay Packers wide receivers last season as a rookie, where he averages 2.2 yards per route run. The other benefit is we know that typically it's a very good bet to bet on wide receivers going into year 2 that had strong rookie seasons. It is also typically a very good bet to bet on wide receivers that are going to be playing in good offenses. Jayden Reed checks all these boxes. That is very exciting for him. But you also have Christian Watson. You also have Dontavian Wicks. You also have Romeo Doubs. You also have the running game. You also have Luke Musgrave. You also have Tucker Kraft. You just have so many guys in this offense. Now, Chris Godwin will be our next player. He's declined for 3 straight seasons now, going from 13.8 down to 11.4, down to 9.9 fantasy points per game. But with some of these other wide receivers that have declined for 3 straight years, such as Devontae Adams, I don't think Godwin's destined to continue to decline. He's only going to be 28 years old this season. And what we have heard is Chris Godwin is actually going to play more snaps on the inside and in the slot this year in comparison to outside where he played last season. Naturally, Chris Godwin is a better slot option than he is an outside option. So if he is able to run more routes and see more snaps in that area of the football field, you could see Godwin get back to where he's been over the past few years. Now, Christian Kirk is a wide receiver that I have drafted so little of. I mean, just not super interested in. The reason being is I don't see where the ceiling comes from. You look at Kirk, back-to-back years now, 65 receiving yards per game. You look at Kirk, pretty much the best year of his NFL career, 11.8 fantasy points per contest in a half PPR format. He's going to be 28 years old this year. You add in Brian Thomas Jr., you have Evan Ingram, you have Gabe Davis. I think Kirk maybe is a very good option if you're playing in a full PPR format where you have multiple starters. My issue with Kirk is if you're playing in a league where you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, I don't see where the ceiling comes from. Now, our next guy will be Keenan Allen. If you are looking at Keenan Allen, he had the best year of his NFL career last season, which is crazy to think about at 31 years old. But you look at the situation and go, okay, well, yeah, Keenan, this is a wide receiver that A, had great quarterback play with Justin Herbert. B, had a coaching staff that really wanted to push the pace of play and run as many plays per game. And C, every other wide receiver in his offense turned to complete dust. Mike Williams gets injured right at the beginning of the season. Quentin Johnston proves to be one of the worst round 1 wide receivers that we have seen in the past decade. So Keenan had great quarterback play and very little competition last year. This year, the quarterback play is probably going to be slightly worse. The competition's going to be a lot higher with the combo of DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. We've had the reports saying Keenan Allen may be fat. I mean, he may be 230 pounds, which obviously isn't fat from a real-life perspective, but from an NFL perspective at wide receiver, it is. Xavier Worthy will be our next guy. Xavier Worthy, definitely not fat. I mean, Xavier Worthy, this is a wide receiver that's been my most drafted Chiefs receiver all offseason, specifically in underdog drafts where we are chasing just the highest ceiling that you could possibly get. My hesitation with Worthy here is going to be, I think that he could potentially be a better real-life option than he is a fantasy football option. The reason being is if we see his speed just ultimately stretch NFL defenses, create space underneath for the running game, for Rishie Rice, for Travis Kelce, I don't know what the target volume looks like for Worthy, even if he really helps opening up this overall Chiefs offense. Now, our next guy will be Rome Odunze. Looking at Rome, great prospect, top 10 pick, great preseason. You are going up against DJ Moore. You are going up against Keenan Allen. And while I think maybe Rome Odunze has a very high ceiling for the last 3 weeks of the year, my issue is if you were to take Rome, you're probably not able to start him for at least the first month of the year. He may end up, I don't want to say clogging a roster spot. I don't know. I just think he's going to start slowly given the amount of competition you have in this offense, and he has the rookie quarterback. Brian Thomas Jr., you can kind of throw him in the same boat, right? I mean, all these wide receivers are great options for the second half of the year where they have elite level ceilings, but at the beginning of the year, maybe a little bit tough to get excited. Christian Watson, I have no idea what to expect with. You go back 2 years ago, he was elite with 2.6 yards per route run. A lot of that coming with big plays. We know those are extremely volatile from a year-to-year perspective. I mean, this past year, Jaden Reed was a lot better than him. You can maybe make the argument that Dontavian Wicks was even more efficient. Deontay Johnson, my issue is I don't see where the ceiling is. He's averaged fewer than 10 points per game for back-to-back seasons. He's dealt with injuries throughout all of training camp and preseason. Right now, the Panthers project to be a bottom 5 offense in the NFL this season based off sportsbook projections. I think Leggett is potentially the wide receiver 1 here, as crazy as that sounds. So Deontay just really hasn't made a difference in fantasy in years. He's in a bad offense, and we're not even certain that he's the wide receiver 1. Now, our next guy is Jackson Smith-Njigba. Now, with JSN, if you go through and look at 21-year-old wide receivers that had a similar rookie season to him since the year 2000, the best comps are Kenny Britt, DJ Moore, George Pickens, Rondale Moore, Robert Woods, Travis Taylor, Antonio Bryant, and Jalen Reagor. If you're looking at the median projection the following year, JSN projects out to see about 11 points per game. If Lockett was gone, I'm all in. The issue is Lockett's still here. Yes, this coaching staff is supposed to run a lot more 3 wide receiver sets. The volume may actually come up in Seattle, but this is something that you've heard time and time again. So JSN, I mean, it is kind of priced in where I think a lot of people are very excited about him despite the really bad season last year. Now, Ladd McConkey will be our next guy. I'm a little bit concerned about Ladd dealing with an injury through training camp, Justin Herbert dealing with an injury through training camp. I mean, obviously Herbert, doesn't have a lot of experience with a ton of these receivers on this roster. And at the same time, this is a completely new coaching staff. So I think that if you are looking at what we had from the Chargers in particular through the preseason and training camp, for Herbert to miss time, it probably hurts the offense more than what we would have seen from a lot of other teams just because they kind of needed that time in my mind. Keon Coleman, our next guy, I didn't like Keon Coleman as a prospect, but I am not a believer in Curtis Samuel. I've talked about that all year. I'm not really a believer in Khalil Shakir either. I think Keon Coleman could very easily be the wide receiver 1 in this offense, and really the only other guy taking a considerable target share here would potentially be Dalton Kincaid. There are a ton of targets available. I know a lot of people are expecting the Bills to be worse this year, but according to sportsbooks, they are currently projected to be a borderline top 5 scoring offense in the NFL this season. Now, our next guy is going to be Hollywood Brown. Has declined for 3 straight seasons, 1.3 yards per route run this past year. So I just simply really have no interest in Hollywood. He's my least drafted Chiefs receiver. Obviously, at this point, if you're going to get a discount on him and you can get him as your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5, that is a much more reasonable price tag. Cortland Sutton, our next guy at 47. Bo Nix looked really good. I mean, if you look at the Denver Broncos receivers, Troy Franklin really didn't do anything. So this may be a wide receiver 2 situation where they're going about it in a wide receiver by committee approach. But Cortland Sutton should be out there for pretty much every single Bo Nix dropback. DeAndre Hopkins at 48. We've already discussed potentially bad offense. Wide receiver that's going into, his age 32 season. I will say the positive that you have is he averaged 15.3 points per game in games specifically played with Will Levis. But he's another year older, coming off an injury where they bring in Calvin Ridley and pay Ridley to be the wide receiver 1. Jamison Williams will be our next guy at 49. I want to give him his respect because I think the Detroit Lions are going to be a great overall offense. Like we said, they currently project to score the 2nd most points in the NFL. Jamison Williams was a decent prospect out of Alabama. I thought he was a little overrated at the time, but that's kind of regardless. And if we're looking at Jamison, he should be playing pretty much every single Jared Goff drop back. I almost think that he falls in a similar boat to like Xavier Worthy, where if he's going to be in the field stretcher role, he may be a better real life option than a fantasy option. And our last wide receiver here will be Joshua Palmer. Herbert's a great quarterback. Quentin Johnson looks like a bum. Ladd McConkey has been banged up. Ladd McConkey has not really proven anything. DJ Chark is banged up. Brennan Rice is flash, but it really doesn't have a strong prospect profile. So Joshua Palmer looks like he's going to have a very large role with a pretty good quarterback this season. But I think that's all I have for you in this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And of course, I'm going to be drafting every single night on Underdog Fantasy. By far and away my favorite place to draft. They're hosting Flock tournaments every Monday and Thursday until the season starts. And if you use code FLOCK when you sign up to Underdog, you're going to get my 2024 rankings. You are going to get a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1. You are also going to get a Travis Kelce special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1 as well. And a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 with the new account with code FLOCK. But I think that's all I have for you. Really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. And I really hope I get to draft with you tonight.